Hi everybody, this is your final exam review for the class. So I'm going to go through the study guide that's posted under week 13. It's also going to be in files on Canvas. And I'm going to go through and talk about what you might do with each of these questions or what I'm looking for just to make sure everybody is thinking along the same lines. So just to give you a heads up, of course, the questions are going to be very similar to same concepts as what you saw in the midterm. And the final exam will have 8 questions. Each question should be answered in 5 to 7 sentences, but do remember if by the time the 24th hits, if you have had 3 or fewer absences and you have an 89.5 average or above, you take half of the exam. So you'll only have to take 4 questions. But you'll know, I'll make sure and let you know as quickly as possible if you are one of that number, so that way you know how to prepare. So no matter who you are, you'll be presented with 8 questions on the exam day. You'll see under week 16 the file pop up. You'll have 24 hours from the time that exam is up to complete it. So take breaks, use your textbook, use your notes, proofread. There's no need to necessarily rush unless you're saying, I just want to get this over with. So everyone will get 8 questions. Some of you will need to answer all 8. Some of you will only need to answer 4. So I'm going to go through, talk about the different questions, and if you have any follow-up questions for me, feel free to email me or call me or text me, and I will be glad to give you more information. Okay, so let's get started. So question number 1, using the topic of voting apathy, ask a broad question that you might answer in a paper. Then, using that broad question as a starting point, ask 3 to 4 narrower, more focused questions you might answer in a paper. How do the more focused questions impact your thinking? So the topic of voting apathy, basically voting apathy, in case you want a working definition, is when people could not care less about voting. They think, this doesn't really affect me, my vote doesn't make a difference, I don't really care. Okay? So what would be, for any kind of paper, a question that you might want to answer that's pretty broad? You could go as broad as you like. And then be able to list 3 to 4 narrower questions. So what I would be looking for is almost like a bulleted list. 1 bullet, what's the broad question? 3 to 4 bullets, what are the more narrow questions? And then in a couple of sentences at the end of that, note what the impact is of those narrower, more focused questions. So the standard length of the answers is going to be typical, like the midterm, 5 to 7 sentences, but I'll also note if bullets could be used in some of these. And again, if I missed something like that, just let me know, and I'll be glad to go back and clarify that. So for voting apathy, a bulleted list is great, and then a couple sentences to follow up on that. With number 2, consider a common idea that seems simple and one-dimensional, the word hope. Using the technique of denying the usual associations, what are typical associations people have with this word? How might you disconnect this word from these associations? So be able to think about how people generally define and relate to this word hope. What do they connect it to? What comes to mind? And then if you think about hope in other senses, how might you define it a little differently? How might you pull it back from these typical associations? So this would be fine in paragraph form and just be able to answer both parts of those questions. What are the typical associations associated with hope? And then how would you define it outside of those typical associations? We're moving on to chapter 2. Note that the chapters are noted here, so in case you want to go look for these reference points, you're welcome to do that, of course, and take plenty of notes and these types of things. So with number 3, chapter 2 discusses detecting subtle tensions, referring to the differences between what people expect and what actually happens. So consider this situation. You turn in a paper you feel you performed poorly on, and instead you receive a good grade. How does this tension between what you expected and what actually happened connect to broader societal tensions? So I don't want you in this answer to discuss the tension that you experienced because you're already given that. You thought you did badly on a paper. Instead, you actually did well. I want you to only focus on in your 5 to 7 sentences for number 3 How does this connect to broader societal tensions? What are specific situations in this world that might relate to other people where the reality is better than the expectation? That they go in thinking, this is terrible or it's going to be bad, and then it ends up being great. Okay, so only think about the broader tensions when answering this question. For number 4, chapter 2 discusses the technique of detecting and busting up a duality. So look at the duality rich versus poor. How does this duality limit thinking on these two concepts, and what gray areas exist between these two words? You only are obligated to answer in sentence form those two questions. You don't have to define what rich means and what poor means unless you feel like that's helpful. Mainly focus on, first off, saying, okay, when we divide people into categories of rich and poor, this limits thinking because, okay? Be able to discuss that in 2 or 3 sentences. And then, what gray areas exist between these two words? Where do rich and poor people actually have things in common that maybe don't get talked about? So be able to explain that in a few sentences as well. Going into number 5, we're getting into chapter 3. Using the strategy draw from a vital source, exemplify and explain the quotation below on the human love of competition. For most people, there is something inexplicably compelling about the nature of competition. Perhaps that's because, as some scholars argue, competitiveness is a biological trait that co-evolved with the basic need for human survival. So with this one, if you're thinking about exemplifying and explaining a quotation, give examples of where you know that to be true. How, in your opinion, is competition compelling? Like, what draws you or other people to compete on any level, in sports, in academics, in work, in anything? And then also be able to discuss how competitiveness is a biological trait that co-evolved with the need for survival. How would you explain that? How would you explain the idea that we compete with each other because many years ago we needed to in order to survive? And be able to explain both of those things. Why are we drawn to competition, and how do you think that evolved along with the need for survival? Number 6 uses the strategy of synthesis from chapter 3. And remember what we talked about with synthesis. It's been quite a while, where you bring together multiple sources that talk about the same topic, and you see where they have things in common. Okay? So using the strategy of synthesis, consider the issue of raising the minimum wage. The argument goes typically that current minimum wage is not enough for people to support themselves and their families. And you will probably need to do a little bit of research on this unless you already know about this topic pretty decently. So for people who work in fast food, people who work in retail, people who work in various roles in restaurants, the idea is that they need to make more than the current minimum wage so that they can go above the poverty level. Okay? So I want you to be able to discuss, where do opposing sides of the issue have agreement on this issue? So for people who are pro raising the minimum wage and people who are against it, where do they come together? What do they care about that's the same? What are they focused on that's the same? Okay? So be able to, in a couple of sentences or a few sentences, talk about people who are pro and against raising the minimum wage. What do they actually have in common? And then, to follow up on that, what is important about examining the different viewpoints on this specific issue? Why do you need to understand why some people are for raising the minimum wage and why some people are against raising the minimum wage? For number 7, consider the concept of social justice. Discuss how it influences your thinking or your daily life. Please look this up in a dictionary. Make sure you have a clear-cut definition. So you would start off with social justice is defined as. Make sure if you're quoting a definition that you do cite it appropriately from the dictionary. And note, social justice according to the Webster's Dictionary is fill in the blank. Okay? And then how does it influence your thinking or your daily life? Do you have a certain attitude about an issue that you feel like goes along with social justice? Do you feel like certain parts of your daily life are influenced by the way you feel about social justice? How does it impact you in any way, shape, or form at all? So far, 2 through 7, this has been paragraph form, except for, outside of that, number 1 has been bullets would be fine, 2 through 7 paragraphs, and the rest of these I think are going to probably end up being more along the line of paragraphs. 1 is just going to be the outlier there. Number 8, consider the concept of existential angst. How does this concept apply to a habit or decision in your life? That's another one that you'll definitely need to look up and have a working dictionary definition. How does the dictionary define existential angst? So first off, define it, and then be able to discuss something that you have done before in your life, a behavior that you keep doing, a decision you've made recently or in the past. How does that indicate that you have experienced existential angst? So with the chapter 4 ones for 7 and 8, you will definitely need to look up some things in a dictionary. Okay, so let's go to number 9. That brings us to chapter 5. Using the topic of school dress codes, compose a fixing thesis, a warning thesis, and a transforming thesis. So this is something we talk more about in chapter 6, but I definitely am blending these chapters, I would say, with number 9. Make sure you do go back to information on what a fixing, a warning, and a transforming thesis are. Okay? And I would say if you're still feeling a little bit stuck, let me know. I do have examples of those in your chapter 6 notes back on that lecture under week 11. So there's some information on that there. But also, too, feel free to go to the textbook and see the examples there. So any of those things would work. So I'm looking for 3 separate sentences here. 1 fixing thesis, 1 warning thesis, and 1 transforming thesis, all on the topic of school dress codes. Each one of them should be some kind of argument. Okay? Then take one of your thesis statements and present 2 to 3 main points that you would want to include in a paper that would help support that. So let's say that your warning thesis you felt like was the strongest. This idea that if we don't implement school dress codes, some negative thing will happen. Then put in 2 to 3 main points that you might include in a paper. This one, technically, I think you could get away with bullets. You could do sentences as well, so I will leave that up to you. Just 3 sentences for your 3 different thesis statements, and then 2 to 3 main points to back up one of those thesis statements. Please don't forget that first part of the question. That's the only time people have not done so well on this one. With number 10, we're sticking with chapter 5. I've given you a passage on how parents' arguments affect their children. So I'm asking you to be able to discuss context there. This passage is a bit long, so I will bypass reading it out loud. But take a look at it and then be able to discuss in 5 to 7 sentences, what's the context? What seem to be the beliefs and attitudes and values of the time period in which this was written that have influenced this? So with this argument, what kind of values are there in the culture about the relationship between parents and children, or the kind of impact parents have on children, or how we should treat children? So think about those things. If you remember our way back talking about the what makes a good wife column, and we talked about context there, be able to discuss beliefs and values of the society in which this piece was written. You don't have to know the date in which it was written to do some really serious educated guesses on what values inform it. Number 11 goes to chapter 6. So you've got a passage here on welfare reform. And it says that, in summation, that Washington or the federal government basically is to blame for our current welfare crisis. Okay? And it is saying that the federal government creating this particular welfare system has depleted people, obstructed their purpose, and extinguished their possibilities. So it's limited the people that it's supposed to be helping. Okay? No matter how you feel about this topic, your task with this question is to dismantle and deny that. Basically, you will need to argue for your answer that Washington is not to blame, that the federal government is not to blame for the welfare crisis, that someone else is to blame, that this person, James, who wrote this is wrong because of reasons A, B, and C. So you'll need to look at this objectively, no matter what feelings you have about this issue, be able to, in a sense, play devil's advocate. Moving along with Chapter 6, this is tying back to issues of claims. So consider this issue, requiring college students to have print textbooks for each class. Some classes are very much centered on you have to have a hard copy. Some classes, electronic is fine. But think about that issue and be able to give a claim for that issue. What would be a thesis statement for a paper on this topic? And then what would be at least 3 reasons you would use in a paper to back up that claim or thesis? Make sure one of your reasons feels a bit less obvious, that maybe is a little bit more creative and off the beaten path. That would be the key there. This one, I guess, technically could also be bulleted as well. Paragraphs or sentences in paragraph form or bullets would work as well. So just to kind of recap, for 12, for 9, and for 1, you could do bullets. So I spoke too soon when I said 1 only. Now we're getting in the home stretch here, getting into chapters 7, 8, and 9. Number 13, consider the term open-minded. How does this term miss something critical? So in effect, think about how you would define the term open-minded, but then what does this overlook? When you say, oh, that person's over-minded, had a little slip there. When you say, oh, that person is open-minded, how does that oversimplify the issue? Or how does that miss where open-minded may not be the best thing all the time? Where is, in effect, the problem with this term, potentially? So for first things first, be able to define open-minded, and then where are the problems with this term, potentially? And you can give specific examples if you would like to. Chapter 7 continues with number 14. Consider the term destruction, and then flip the terms and examine destruction in light of its opposite, creation. Why is it important to examine the opposite? I would actually, in my opinion, I would give definitions of destruction and creation here. Either dictionary definitions or your personal definitions. And I would say be able to not only define these 2 terms, but then move to why is it important to look at these 2 together? Why should you look at destruction and think about creation at the same time? What is significant about putting those 2 words together? Number 15, education includes maxims. Of course, maxims tie into our discussion about status quo, these statements that we take for granted, like what doesn't kill us makes us stronger, no pain, no gain, beauty is only skin deep. So think about educational maxims. And actually, if you were a lucky person, you might have picked this one for one of your classwork assignments. Take a look at this particular maxim and discuss where it might be a problem. Everyone learns differently. Why might that be an issue? What might be the effects of a teacher using that principle in the classroom? Or a principal or a school administrator, anybody who's involved in education operating on that assumption that everyone learns differently. Okay? Why might that maxim be suspicious? Chapter 8 also includes fallacies, wrong cause, wrong name, wrong conclusion. So I would say definitely if you need to have a little refresh to go back to Chapter 8 and see how those are defined, what examples are present there, be able to discuss examples that you've seen of each one of these in an argument. So what is one wrong cause that you've heard before? What is one wrong name you've heard before? and what is one wrong conclusion you've heard before. If you get this question, there's no shame in doing a little bit of Googling around and finding some pop culture examples, some advertising examples. It could be conversations, though, that you've had in the past with someone, so I'll leave it up to you in that case. This could potentially be bullets, but I think sentences in a paragraph are completely fine as well. So be able to give one wrong cause example, one wrong name example, and one wrong conclusion example. The more that you can explain how these fit those things, or the more you can explain the examples, that's going to be extremely helpful for you. Now, chapter 9 is going to be all about you looking at your patterns of thought in the past. So, question number 17, explain at least 2 criteria you use to judge your own behavior. Where did these come from? So, for example, is one criterion you use to judge your behavior morality, harm reduction, anything along those lines? And where did that come from? So if you say, okay, well, one criterion I use to judge my behavior is morality. Well, that came from my parents. They taught me right from wrong from the time I was a little kid. So be able to explain those 2 things. If you're trying to judge if your behavior is good or bad, what are those criteria and where did they come from, or who did they come from? And then finally, number 18, discuss a time when you snapped out of a patterned way of thinking. What prompted your change? What did that process look like? When you used to believe something or used to feel a certain way about something, but stopped or eased out of it, what made that happen for you? So think along those lines of how did you get from point A to point B in explaining. The rubric for this exam is the same as on the midterm, and I'll have this copy, of course, posted under week 13 for your reference. If you're looking over this video, if you've heard my explanations and you still feel like there's a couple areas where you'd like to have more conversations, just send me your questions. If I have a few of them, I'll post them up in Canvas, answer them for everyone's sake. That way, everybody's on the same page. So hopefully this gives you a little bit more information beyond just looking at the sheet, so you're all prepped for the exam. And as it gets closer, I'm going to give you your exact date and just remind you of those instructions for that day. All right, so hopefully this is something that has worked out well for you. If you need any follow-ups about the exam study guide, just keep in touch with me.